Hi, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your Friday to join Zach and I for this webinar. We will, allow for a couple of minutes just here for everyone to join in. We see a bunch of participants coming in. We're so happy you're here today. So we'll give it a couple of minutes and then we'll get started. Just general housekeeping. We will, feel free to chat with us in the general chat. Be sure that you send it to all panelists and attendees. At the end, we'll take questions through the Q&A feature. That just allows us to track all the questions and make sure that we answer all of them. So if you will use that. And also, if there is like a thought that you have or a question throughout the presentation and you kind of just want to chat it to us very quickly, we'll do our best to keep an eye on that throughout the presentation. And allow people to jump in. If also you would like to chime in at the end more than just chatting, we can also unmute folks if you raise your hand. So if you use the raise hand feature on Zoom, I'll be able to identify who you are and unmute your mic. And so if you'd like to chime in and share with us, we want this to be a community discussion as well. Please feel free to use that feature and I'll make these reminders again. But if you're just joining us, welcome, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Zach and I are really excited to hold the space for us today, and we're excited that you were able to take some time out of your day to join us. Give us just a minute or two to let other participants join in, and then we'll get started. Thank you so much. Okay, so it looks like a good number of participants have joined. We'll go ahead and get started. Today, Zach and I will be covering effective student communication during COVID-19. And again, Zach mentioned this in the chat, but the recording of the presentation today, as well as the slide deck, will be available for you to download. Give us until Monday or Tuesday to get that up, and we will email all of the live participants, as well as those who registered and weren't able to join us live. Feel free to pass these on to your colleagues. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So again, good afternoon, welcome. My name is Senna, and I am the program manager of Virtual Student Support Program here at the Trellis Company. And essentially, my role is to work with we have a federally funded program, and we work with institutions of higher education in Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Georgia to help support them in their enrollment and retention efforts. And so as a part of that, I send text message campaigns, strategic enrollment campaigns work with these institutions to support their students. And in the last year, we sent over 1.2 million text messages. And these messages included financial aid information, as well as motivational, retention, enrollment, advising. And so we have quite a bit of experience here in-house in connecting and engaging with students in the virtual space, as well as working with them and connecting with them on social media. So, and in my background, I have a background working on higher ed campuses. I've worked in retention and access programs at UC San Diego, at UT Austin, and now here at Trellis supporting institutions across sort of the Southeast.
Excellent, and welcome everybody. Good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Zach. I'm an institutional support consultant at Trellis. I recently defended my dissertation from UT Austin a few weeks ago, and I have specialized in higher education communication and web accessibility for the past couple years. I've presented across the country, Canada, and Mexico about clarifying student communication, whether that's email, text message, website, phone call, and especially during this time, it's so incredibly important to kind of consolidate and simplify communication. And I've worked in higher education for about 12 years in a variety of supervisory and communication roles. I was a program director for a mentoring program in Wisconsin. I was a teacher. I've been a research assistant, worked in enrollment management and admissions as well. And so I'm really glad that Sana and I can come together today, kind of synthesize our experience and our expertise, and really inform the community in this time that information is so readily available and so many different communication channels. How are students and how are institutions leveraging those technologies during this crisis moment during COVID-19? So I'm so glad to see everyone here, and we can't wait to get started.
Yeah, excellent. And I should mention, Zach is new to our team, so we're really excited to have him here and to support us. We are doing a ton of work in the community about effective crisis communication and in general engaging with students during this time. And so to the extent that Zach and I can be a resource for you, we'll have our contact information shared out when we share the slide deck. And so feel free to reach out to us as well if you have any questions or anything that we can support you with. So what we'll be covering today, we're going to look at the current landscape of higher education. We're going to talk about what a crisis is and crisis communication, and then of course, best practices in crisis communication. And then we'll transition over to text messaging, because that is the work that we do here at Trellis. And so we'll talk about the power of text messaging and connecting to students on their phones. Also about resource allocation. And then we want to give you some immediately actionable steps, some high quality COVID-19 resources. And then the most important part, we think at least, is opening it up for questions and discussion, so that you all get to share, best practices or lessons learned, and also get to ask questions. We find that this part of the webinar is most fruitful because we have our experience to share, but we know many of you all are practitioners, you work in this space, and you have learned so much, just like we have over the last 2 weeks. And so we're really excited to hear from you as well. So with that, we'll talk about, what is happening in higher education right now. Zach and I took a very kind of surface level kind of scan on social media of what students were saying, of what reporters were saying. And we took some of these screenshots and we brought them here for you. And I'm sure that you're not unfamiliar with this, but we want to share with you what we found. And so, we have a student who's saying that my college sent out an email basically saying, if you leave Canada, you'll have to self-isolate for 14 days. And it went on to say, please be aware, missing class will have severe impact on completion. So students are grappling with two very real realities, right? So with many that have extended spring breaks, but when they go back, they're still trying to figure out, okay, well, now I'm at home. Do I have a device where I can connect to? Do I have internet? I have to still worry about my classes while potentially assisting my parents who may be unemployed or underemployed. Many students have now become babysitters or teachers to their younger siblings or other family members. So there's a very, very distinct reality that they're facing at home, in addition to being sure that they're successful and able to complete the term. So we've seen quite a number of tweets and Instagram posts about students talking about how challenging it's been at home and the struggles they're facing. And then we've also found, from the newly admitted students, so if you're an institution of higher education, that you have your current students that you are working with, but you are also looking ahead to the enrollment cycle, and you're thinking, okay, well, what about those that we have given offers of admission who we want to welcome to our community in the fall? Are we connecting with them? And we found that, some institutions are, some organizations are, and others are not, because they're still trying to figure out what's happening with their current students. And so there's the tweet from the student that says, I'm noticing that outreach from some colleges is sort of helpful and genuine, but the other colleges are like crickets. And Zach and I will talk, a lot more in this presentation about how do we address those real concerns that students have. But really, I wanted to take a moment on this slide to talk about the power of social media, and also emphasize that if you have the capacity and if you have the opportunity, are you scanning social media to see what your students are saying about their experience right now? Are you able to do, a search on whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, if you have the capacity? And this is a great project for student ambassadors to do even remotely, or if you have interns that, are working remotely still. This is a great project for them to do, is do a scan on social media and start to understand, are there narratives out there? What are our students saying? What are they experiencing? So that, one, we can get ahead of that, but two, we know how do we adjust our communication and our outbound outreach to our current students, our newly admitted students, so that we are ahead of their challenges, and we're giving them the resources they need as well. Zach, anything you wanted to add here?
Not really. No, so many of the headlines and so many of the student concerns over social media are kind of paradoxically communication concerns. How do I find resources? Who's contacting me? Something I really appreciated about institutions that I've been affiliated with is that the communication has been consistent, and the resources are fairly centrally located, but so much student outreach right now is, I need help. who's communicating with me, what's available to me, where do I find it? And then on the back end, are institutions ready when they do reach out with that communication, whatever that looks like? Is there the capacity on campus or in the virtual space to actually serve those students who are in desperate, dire need right now? So it's absolutely critical to be communicating clearly during this time.
Great. Thanks, Zach.
And communicating during this time, a lot of journalism right now is trying to avoid the word crisis and the word emergency. Something that I've noticed just doing some scraping of news stories is that the CDC recently used the word crisis, but referred to it as COVID-19 affecting the mental health of folks, and that it is a crisis in that regard. That is a word that communicators and journalists tend to try to avoid because it immediately sparks fear and anxiety and some sort of panic in the reader. Typically, crisis communication researchers have scanned the field across business, private sector, public sector, government, military entities about what a crisis actually is and how we're defining that. Unexpected, negative, and overwhelming. If that is not COVID-19, then I have not been reading the right news. um, and especially in higher education, because so many students are tied to those institutional resources. If the institution is suffering something that's unexpected, negative, and overwhelming, students immediately feel that, whether it's food insecurity, housing, academics. Students who are residential students, especially, how far away are they from home and what does home look like? That's an immediate personal crisis that students are feeling right now. We may not be calling it a crisis, but it is absolutely a crisis that's affecting so many people. And everything underlined in blue in this presentation is hyperlinked. We'll send the PowerPoint later, and you'll be able to navigate to those resources. So communication during COVID-19 now, whether or not you call it a crisis or not, your recipient of that communication is going to deem it crisis communication. Every single bit of information you send out that's COVID-19 related is going to be perceived by your stakeholders, whether that's students, that's faculty, staff, people who are in emergency services sending information and receiving information from the institution. It's all crisis communication at this point, in this moment that we're in right now. And we need to be aware of that when we're sending it out to students and other stakeholders. So some institutional kind of best practice information, first and foremost, is the information high quality, accurate, and updated? So if you notice on social media, a lot of the stories that are shared are not from direct or firsthand sources. So a lot of them is not CDC information, not World Health Organization information. It is a news outlet that is taking information from those direct sources, putting a little bit of spin on it, adding a little bit more information that may or may not be accurate and updated, and then sending that out to readership. So right now, it is so important. Your crisis communication has to be evidence-based. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a story circulating on social media and through a lot of popular news outlets that was positioning acetaminophen and some Advil and Tylenol medications as dangerous and potentially complicating COVID-19 symptoms. And that essentially has been largely disproven by the CDC and the World Health Organization. Our students, are you as an institution sending out resources that are accurate, that are updated, and that are high quality? That has got to be the priority at this point. And to help avoiding the spread of fake news and misinformation, it's really, really difficult for a student to get something from their institution. You are a trusted stakeholder and authority in their lives. If they're getting certain messaging from you and then reading something else different from a different resource, that's going to be confusing, and you don't want your institutional communication to get lost in the noise. It can be easy to information overload right now. So high quality, accurate, updated information, that's got to be on folks' priority lists.
And also, you want to think about, is the communication honest, flexible, and sympathetic? As we mentioned when we were talking about the scam on social media, our stakeholders or our students are going through a lot right now. They are having to deal with a home environment that may be stressful, overwhelming. Many of our vulnerable students are dealing with food insecurity, potentially homelessness, and also may not have a safe space that you may call it their home, but that may not be a safe space for them. So as we communicate with them, as we share with them important updates, important information about whether you're a nonprofit, has a participant in a program, or you're an institution of higher education, are we honest? Are we flexible? Are we sympathetic? Are we acknowledging that there is a lot going on right now? And so in our world, in our space, when we're texting students, yes, we need to remind them that they may need to complete their FAFSA, and yes, they need to know that they need to still register for classes or be sure they have their Zoom set up for online classes starting next week. But in addition to that, is there an opportunity for you to check in to express that you are concerned for their safety, for their well-being, and that you as the institution or the program are here for them? I think that messaging is critical right now, and you will find that you will have more engagement and response rates when you acknowledge the struggle and challenges students are facing with, and then you go on to then remind them about other task related information. So in this space, whether it's use multimedia, gifs, memes, use a motivational quote, we found that students are responding really well to that, and they're very appreciative when we acknowledge that this is a moment where they are struggling, and this is a challenge for them. And we also want to say that different students just respond differently. So being culturally responsive and being aware of your audience. And so just this morning we were talking about help seeking behaviors, and how first gen students really struggle to ask for help. They really struggle to say, like, yes, I need help right now, yes, I'm struggling right now. So if we understand that, how can we pivot our communication to then fit their needs? If we are sending communication to students who are at risk, are we instead of asking them what they need, can we just create a list or a toolkit of resources that we know are at their highest needs right now? And so kind of getting ahead and being understanding of where they're at, and what will be what will help them engage with us best. And we want to understand the differences and communicate with students how they want to be communicated with. So whether you are posting on social media, or you're texting students, or you're emailing students, we want to be sure that we also understand the metrics behind each of those. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail in a couple of slides. But if you find that your students are not as engaging via email, then is picking up the phone and connecting with them that way best, or is texting with them, or is social media. We need to also determine what works best for our audience.
And to that point, then, understanding kind of student preferences, lots of research has posited that students want consistent, personalized communication. So, what that looks like from institution to institution is going to be very different, but it does send a really mixed message to students when they get 12 email blasts one week and then one or two the next week, or they're all coming on a Monday and then the next week they all arrive on a Thursday. Obviously, as events happen, you need to be flexible and inform students in a timely manner. But something that I have appreciated from my former institutions and that I've had my colleagues share with me is we hear from our president on a weekly basis. Some of it's check-in information, some of it's a status update on campus closures or work conditions or online learning, but there's some consistency. The communication, the dialogue is continuing. And that's what was so troubling about looking into how students were reaching out on social media, because the communication got cut off. And maybe it was a shock to the institutional system that, okay, here's this crisis moment. We need to get our game plan in order to be able to communicate effectively with students. But in that lag time, students were kind of left in the dark. And to be consistent with them and continue that communication, especially as folks return from spring break, transition maybe to more online learning, that consistency is so important. And it makes students feel connected, even though they may not be on campus and they may not be actually connecting in person because of physical distancing kind of guidelines now. And students then will take that information and they will absolutely ask other students about it. They will norm what they're hearing from their institution, not only with themselves at the same institution, but inter-institutionally and intra-institutionally. So I've already had colleagues reach out from hundreds of different schools asking me, what is your school saying? How is your school communicating with you, to kind of norm information and see if information is accurate? So understand that anything you send out, students will be talking about amongst themselves, and that consistency and that high quality of information is so important. And then if you haven't already, getting an inventory of who's on the leadership team, who is delivering crisis communication, and when is that going out from who. It is a much different statement, and especially in the nonprofit and public organization space outside of higher ed. Is the messaging coming from the CEO? Is it coming from the director of marketing or communications? How are students and stakeholders going to perceive that differently if it's an executive level leader delivering that communication in mass, whether it's an email or a text message or an automated phone call, just a phone message from an executive leader, or it's coming from a dean level or an assistant director at an organization or nonprofit? Where that communication comes from and how consistent is really, really important for student engagement. And I think we all need to think about that in our own context as we kind of move forward. Something that I have harped on for years at this point is keeping it simple and not over communicating. So the consistency is important. But just this week, I received 38 emails from different professional organizations offering resources and some best practices. And some of those links and resources in those organizational listserv emails and in the phone call and the text message communication I've received is actually redundant. And I looked at the readability level of some of those emails, 18th or 19th grade English reading comprehension level, way too difficult for the average student to read. And institutional crisis communication should be scaled down to about the 8th grade level. So the most recent literacy statistics that we have, especially in moments of crises and in communication best practices, 8th grade level is what about the average US adult reads and comprehends at. This is why we see magazines like Us Weekly and People being very, very popular, because they're full of pictures and they're very, very easy to read. Our US Department of Defense and all their recruitment materials for the Army, the Air Force, the Marines, every bit of communication is 8th grade level or lower, because they need to make sure that everyone can read and comprehend it. If you're not sure about how to do that, I know a lot of organizations and institutions of higher education kind of run on Microsoft and the Microsoft suite. I have linked in below instructions on how to use the built-in readability tool in all Microsoft Word packages to audit your own level of communication, aiming for not much higher than the 8th grade level. It's about cutting sentence length, using a very small lexicon or a dictionary of words, not using overly complicated words, writing an active voice, just basic literacy best practices to make sure that you're keeping it simple. Because right now, in a crisis moment, reading comprehension level will decrease by 2 or 3 levels because of the stress that we're feeling. Human beings don't read and comprehend to their utmost ability if they feel stressed. We tend to skim information, look for immediate resources, and fail to read and comprehend like we normally do. So right now is so critical, keeping it simple and don't over communicate with students right now.
And we mentioned this earlier, but of course, use preferred common forms of technology. Text messages can be personalized. You can write in, "Hey, Zach, how are you doing? We're here to support you. Go here to see a list of the resources we have available to help you during this time." And so in that, less than 300 characters, we were able to personalize the message. We were able to identify what exactly Zach may be experiencing, and we were able to give him the resource he needed. Another best practice there would be to add in where Zach can go if he had questions that he needed to ask. And so in a small nudge, we were able to incorporate all of these elements The research has found that messages sent through text messages are perceived to be more serious than warning signs sent through social media. We find that in social media, students have to have various settings, whether they are following an institution or they have to filter through all of the notifications that they are receiving on all of the various channels they're on. It is really challenging to keep up with that. But when you receive a text message from the institution or the program that's personalized, that's directed towards you, it's more effective. It gets the students' attention. And we also found in the research, and what's been really effective for us here at Trellis is that students are on their phones, so it's easy to meet them there. This survey done by the Pew Research Center on Internet and American Life found that 68% of teens text on a daily basis. 1 in 3 sends more than 100 text messages a day. So they are on their phones, they're communicating on their phones, they're connecting with each other. And now we have this opportunity as institutions of higher education, as organizations and community-based organizations, we can connect with students on their phone. And also, we've also found, and Zach, chime in here about the research, but non-traditional students are also responding on their cell phone as well. So while that data isn't necessarily captured here, because this is focused in on teens, we're finding that non-traditional students are also very responsive and communicative on their phones, and that they appreciate that mode of communication because instead of having to filter through all of their emails and have to figure out like, who do I need to follow on social media, they're able to get a very direct nudge on their phone with what they need to do or where they need to go if they need additional information.
Absolutely. I mean, think about all the non-traditional students at particularly the 2-year level that have full-time work commitments, have family commitments or caretaking commitments. How likely are they going to be sitting on their phone on social media all day waiting for alerts? It's unlikely. And some of the research has found that those non-traditional students, even though we kind of associate texting with maybe younger communication habits, it's so applicable to the non-traditionally aged students. And I know, personally myself, I would be considered right at this moment a non-traditionally college-age student. I prefer text messaging because it's direct, it's immediate, it reaches me any time of day. I don't have to go filter through all the noise to get to the information that I need. So to Sana's point, it's so powerful for all students, not just the traditionally aged residential students that we think of when we think about text messaging.
And then the beauty of sending a text message to students is that we can nudge them, so we personalize it, but we ensure that it's timely, that it's relevant. We provide access to resources and one-on-one counseling. The students, especially students who are entering into the higher education at this moment of time, it is complex enough to apply to all of the different colleges, to understand all of their various admission processes, but to do it now when there may not be a physical campus that you can visit where you can go in person, it is even more challenging right now. And so they are having to deal with understanding higher ed and then understanding it during COVID-19. That's a whole different ball game. And so to the degree that we can nudge students and counsel students, it's effective to do on text messaging. It's cost effective. You're able to serve more students with less staff, of course, and the research has found that it is impactful in retention and in yield. And so if you're thinking about how can we, move the needle on retention, how can we continue to get a pulse on our enrollment management strategy? Well, text messaging students and connecting with students in this space has been found to be really effective. And we have a lot of research now from various folks across the country, and institutions have found that when you text students with a purpose and you are able to zoom in on the specific task that they need to do in that moment, we're going to see results. When the text message campaigns are just broad and general, they don't have a cadence, they're not consistent, and they don't provide access to resources, we find less engagement from students. And so it's really important, especially right now, for students who are entering into higher education, high school seniors, that we have this opportunity to guide them through the process, through summer melt, of course, and that we are able to connect with them one-on-one and provide them the resources that they need in this critical time. Here at Trellis, I talked about the 1.2 million text messages we did, but we texted students through comprehensive text campaigns throughout the student life cycle. So that was pre-college, in college, and post-college. So the pre-college, and which is traditionally called summer melt, although I would say that when you start a summer melt campaign in the summer, it might be actually too late. We actually encourage our institutions to begin earlier than the summer to get ahead of that summer melt rate that you may be facing at your organization or your institution. So in the pre-college space, we're looking at of course applying to college, but getting through FAFSA and verification, understanding financial aid more broadly, registration and payment, and then all of the things that a student has to do to get ready before they even arrive on campus for the first day of class. So they have to submit their transcript, their immunization records, they have to update documents. If they've been selected for verification, that's an additional hurdle that they have to face. And so we have texted students in this space, and then we transition that pretty seamlessly from the moment they're admitted to then to the first day class and then into a retention campaign. So once they're enrolled and at the institution, then are we sending them academic check-ins? Are they aware of all of the various student life events that are happening on campus? Do they understand their financial aid, and are they budgeting appropriately for the term? And that then very nicely transitions into the post-college space. And so here we're thinking about loan management, alumni coaching, stop out student engagement, exit loan counseling. So we're essentially reaching the students via text message through the full life cycle. And in that way, they know that, this is a trusted, reliable source. I can text my questions to this number. I will receive a response, whether it's about my FAFSA or about dropping this class, or about, well, now I've graduated, what about my loan repayment? And if you start with that consistent, reliable source and you continue that style, that cadence from the very beginning, we have found that students will continue to engage with you throughout that life cycle. Zach, anything you wanted to add in here?
Yeah, depending on when you're communicating with students, especially during this COVID-19 crisis, being really, really sensitive to the kind of communication that is going to be enrollment management focused or some sort of task focused versus care focused. And it could be something that you talk with your leadership team about, which we're actually going to talk about in a second, about what kind of tact and what kind of approach do you want to adopt in this moment right now? Is it appropriate in this moment to talk about having a student complete an institutional process when right now they're displaced and they have, and they're living with friends, something like that? That's such an institutional conversation to have because the student context is so nuanced across the country. But that doesn't mean the communication should stop. And so communicating some of those institutional processes, getting students to think about, we are going to get through this. There's going to be summer. You're going to have a choice to make. There's going to be enrollment in the fall. You're going to have financial aid. Colleges and universities and organizations aren't going to go away forever. This is a weird moment we're experiencing right now. Some sense of normalcy can kind of be developed through a or a text campaign throughout a student's life cycle, especially if you have that organized right now. You can really maintain a sense of normalcy so students don't feel so panicked and so stressed during this crisis moment.
That's exactly right, Zach. And I'd like to add here too, especially in the summer melt and the enrollment space, many of the students that I work with, they are first generation college students. They are students that come from minority backgrounds, and they may have never been to a college campus. This was something that they were looking forward to. They were excited about visiting college, going on tours, and they can't really do that right now, and they're dealing with a lot right now. And so this is a really great opportunity to welcome them to your community, to your space virtually. So do you have a virtual tour set up? Can they see pictures of dorms? Can they connect with alumni virtually? Can they, are there alumni in their local area that can reach out to them to do a Zoom meetup, right? And so there is this huge opportunity here to really get creative and to think about all of the ways we can still serve and support our students, and yet, like Zach said, have some sort of normalcy around it, right? Like this is, yes, it's a trying and a challenging, stressful time, but we also know that we need to get students through this and we need to prepare them for the fall. And we can do that with acknowledging the challenges that they are facing and giving them the resources that they need to get through this. And we have found that, whether it's Facebook Live or Instagram Live or doing like a community chat, these are all have been really effective right now because students are looking to connect with other people, right? As maybe you have noticed, it is uh, a little lonely to work from home, and maybe have your kids, your pets, and everything's going on, but you crave human contact, you crave connecting with your colleagues, with your students. I was a practitioner, worked in enrollment management, admissions, and student success. You miss working with your students and the energy they bring on campus, and so I completely understand that. But let's channel that into how we can do this temporarily virtually, and let's start to employ some of these resources like text messaging and social media to connect with students in a way that's impactful, effective, and meets the goals of the institution, whether they're retention or whether they're enrollment.
Yep. So here is what your leadership team, especially in communications, but obviously getting approval from executive leadership, if you need to, is have you consolidated and done that inventorying of every single piece of resource that students could find either on campus or off campus. So what I'm seeing now in my email inbox is institutions acknowledging the crisis and saying we are here to support you, and then having every bit of support service that they can offer in kind of one consolidated communication piece. Now, that consolidation and that centralization probably should have been ready to go 3 weeks ago. And a lot of institutions and organizations are now just consolidating those resources. If you have not done that already, you got to get with your leadership team and ask a very simple question: what do we have? What do we have? What are all the resources we can engage with? And then consolidating, centralizing those resources. And here's where it's going to look different from institution to institution and organization to organization. Is it a web page? Is it a PDF file that you're going to send out as part of an email blast? And can that be regularly updated? So understanding your institutional capacity, it's great to publish a web page and blast it out and make it very easy for students to access. But just like what we talked about earlier with the high quality information sources, is that web page able to be updated consistently? If you're going to create something that students are going to interact with, an informational resource, that has got to be institutionally dedicated. There's got to be someone or a team who can consistently update that so students get the most high quality information possible. So not only the information you're sending at a national or state level, but institutional level, that's so important as well. Simplify that messaging as well, not having to reinvent the wheel. I've seen a lot of organizations and institutions actually just reword and paraphrase all of the instructions for staying safe and healthy that the CDC had on their website. Not reinventing the wheel. These folks are professionals and have created really simple resources for a global community. Use those resources and don't feel like you have to reinvent the wheel and create a bunch of new content. There's so much good stuff out there that is high quality, immediately updated, and from really, really trusted resources. And then, as Sana was saying, facilitating some sense of normalcy and consistency. Right now, students are, and faculty, staff members especially, are aching for some sort of consistency and normalcy. And that is the next step that y'all need to take then, is once you have that consolidated resource web page or PDF or whatever, consistently updating that, sending that out, and facilitating some sense of normalcy. Your institution, your organization is here for you. We're going to support you in any way we can. Here is the communication that we've arranged and organized for you. It sends a kind of a multi-tiered message that, one, a student is a part of or involved with an institution that is organized and that is robust and that is high quality, and also that the institution or organization cares about you. When I hear from my college president or organizations that I'm a part of, I feel cared about. And that normalcy and consistency is so critical in this moment where there is so much inconsistency and just crisis right now. Absolutely.
And it's especially important for our most vulnerable students, right, Zach? So we have, like I mentioned earlier, we have students dealing with food insecurity. We have students who are dealing very, grappling with the reality of suddenly becoming homeless, and also potentially not having a safe home, or overnight becoming a kindergarten teacher to their younger sibling, which we've heard of as well. And so they're going through a lot right now. And so how do we communicate to them that we care, that we are here to support them, and maybe not in person for now, but virtually they can rely on us, they can count on us, as being consistent in our communication with them. And so that's key. And whichever channel you decide works best for your institution, whether you want to do an email, you do text, you do social media, you do phone calls, you have a blog, we just ask that you take an inventory of what it all is being posted, and that you find ways to consolidate that messaging, centralize it, and simplify it, like Zach said. And again, we will be sending out the slide deck, and there's a ton of resources at the end. And so if that's helpful to you and your organization, please take advantage of that.
So now kind of the all hands on deck leadership team type stuff. Have you inventoried everything you have and all the possible people that could be affected? A lot of times in the communications I've seen, it has been student focused. But institutions of higher education are not just students, it is faculty, it is staff, it is contractors, third party contractors, especially at different organizations that may only work on a campus every few weeks or every month. Those are campus community members, those are educational stakeholders. It's everybody. Have you inventoried everyone that your organization cares about, essentially? And then inventoried all those resources, not only for students, but faculty, staff, and families as well. Is the inventory organized? And then kind of the three-pronged approach. Are you sharing them? Have you shared them? Do students know about them? Who is sharing them? What message does it send for the president to send something versus the communications director versus a CEO versus an assistant director versus a support staff member? How are they being shared? Because there are limitations of social media, there are limitations of text message. Are the consistent resources being shared in a consistent way? How are they being shared? And are they easy for students to find? There are going to be mistakes made by leadership teams. We are human, it happens. Our information and our resources intuitive for students and faculty and staff to seek out? Where are they on the website? Where are they in emails? Where are they in text messages and across social media? The ease of access is so important right now because students are at home, faculty, staff, support members are at home on their computers, and there is an endless stream of information to have to sift through and sort through all the noise to try to find what's really valuable and what's high quality. Information should be intuitive for students to find. One best practice that I've kind of seen emerge that I plan on writing about in the future is landing page notifications. So when you go to the institutional website, almost every organization and higher education institution right now has a COVID-19 banner about we understand it's affecting communities differently. Click here for certain kinds of resources and updates. That's fantastic. There should be something on landing pages that immediately recognize why many people are visiting that website in that moment and immediately directing them to resources. A lot of students, a lot of faculty, staff are going to be Googling institution names and just trying to find emergency resources, funding resources, academic resources. If those could be on that landing page for your organization or institution, that's so easy to find. Students and faculty and staff don't have to sift around through a bunch of information. Sana, do you want to add anything more to that about kind of leadership team reflection?
Yeah. So in the work that we do in consulting with higher education institutions, we have found that each institution has its own strategy. And this is not something that we've not heard of, but like often institutions and their organizations work in silos. So you may have one department doing fantastic communication to the students of engineering, and it's great, but then we have other departments that maybe aren't, and maybe we're not all aware of what the emergency management team is doing, and then financial aid is here doing their own thing. So to what degree can we bring these stakeholders together? Can we have is this an opportunity to bring those silos together and to have a conversation about what are the resources that are important to the students in each of these various buckets, but what are those resources that are important to everyone, regardless of whether they're an engineering student or a communication student or whether they're staff or faculty. What is important for everyone? And I found, working this week on so many calls and so many emails, that it's really hard to stay connected with your own team virtually, right? So maybe you're not aware that the financial aid office or that the program office that is in a different city in your state, as a part of your community-based organization, is doing something else because you just haven't had that opportunity to connect. We're not doing staff meetings maybe as frequently because there's so much happening. And so if there's something that we would say here as we think about internally, how do we organize ourselves so that we can support our students? Taking stock of what's happening in each of the various areas on campus is important, and understanding what messages are being sent out and are they consistent. And that if one department or if one organization has found really helpful resources or has found a way that they are engaging with students that's impactful, can we replicate that, right? Because folks on the ground know what's working and what doesn't work. We know, if you're a practitioner, you know how to reach your students and you know what's effective. Are you sharing those best practices with your colleagues across the space? Are they aware of what's going to work and what's not going to work? Are they being culturally responsive? Are they understanding that various groups of students need to be communicated in different ways? And so if you're aware of that, if you're a practitioner, if you have worked in this space, now is the time to share those best practices across campus, across organizations, so that we can get everyone on the same page. So here, Zach compiled this list of high quality resources. This will be a clickable PDF, and so feel free to click through. And if any of these are, helpful to you, please use them. But really, we wanted to get to the main point, or like the biggest, I think, the opportunity that we have here. We have over 150 live participants. We're really excited to have you all here, but we know that you have questions, or we would like to hear from you about your best practices, or what you're facing on the ground, what you're struggling with, what you're grappling with, and we can have other folks chime in and offer any feedback. And of course, Zach and I are here to answer any questions as well. So with that, if you want to send your questions to the Q&A, or if you want to chat with us in the discussion box, both of those are open now. And if you'd like to speak, just raise your hand and I will unmute your mic so that you can also chime in.
Great. And before we have anyone chime in as well on the resources, the CDC is one of the rare organizations that has actually translated some of their content into non-English languages. So the CDC guidelines for self-protection during COVID are available in native Chinese and Spanish, and that is exceptionally rare in the resource space right now because a lot of organizations and institutions are assuming English fluency. It's a very kind of Anglo-centric attitude to take. So we have to understand too, so many of our stakeholders might not be English speakers or fluent English speakers. And that is why those high quality resources, the CDC has got to be your one-stop shop right now because they have the capacity to really practice some linguistic equity and talk to all students, no matter their language status. So really important. And that might be a best practice in the future about translating emergency crisis content. But again, institutional resources are so limited that how possible is it to translate a crisis communication text message into all 180 languages spoken on a campus? That's a really, really huge challenge for institutions right now about how we can translate the content and also make it web accessible for our students with disabilities to make sure that they have equal access and opportunity to information like everyone does.
Here on the questions and discussion page, we've also talked about, put in a few other resources here about what's happening on college campuses across the space, the student impact, of course, and then enrollment management. We know it's Friday. It's been a long week. And so if you don't have a question right now, that's okay. It has been, for those of us working on the front lines, it has been tiring and exhausting. And we have our own families and personal space that we're working through to figure out. So feel free to reach out to Zach and I post webinar on Monday. If you think of a question, feel free to reach out to us then. If anyone would like to chime in or would like to share what's worked for their organization or for their institution, feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you. So I'll give it a couple of just seconds here.
Yeah, one of the question came through, and Sana, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the recording is going to be on our organizational website. Is that correct, Sana?
Yeah, so we will send an email to all participants and registrants as soon as the recording is available. And that webpage will also include the slide deck as well, so you can download both. Okay, and it looks like we had one more question come in. So, Zach, the question is, how do you manage timely communication via text messages with students?
Yeah, absolutely. So first and foremost, understanding your institutional capacity about what you're asking and if you can actually respond. Because now text messaging communications, especially things like Mongoose and Signalvine, there's the capacity for students to actually respond to text messages. Now, if you're asking students a broad question right now about, okay, we want to send a really timely message out about if students right now are food secure. Well, what does that question look like? Are you asking a yes or no question, or are you directing them to resources? So the first thing on the list is prioritizing what message needs to go out immediately. Do we want to just have it be a one-way communication of just offering a resource? And do we have the capacity to actually go back and forth with students and respond to text messages? Depending on organizational size, if you send an institutional campaign out to 15,000 students, and if you have a 10% response rate, how are you going to respond to those 1,500 students? Do you have the capacity for that? So that's how I would begin to manage the kind of the timely communication. And Vanessa actually asked kind of a parallel question about encouraging students to read their emails. One thing you may want to do, this is kind of from the text messaging space, but students tend to interact with text messages if you greet them by name. So if you do have the capacity to add their name into the subject line and the email is coming from a source that they already know. So here's something really important about leadership team planning is who is sending the email? Does the student know who the email is coming from? That is super important. So one, familiarity with the sender. That encourages students to read an email. Do they know who it's coming from? And is it personally addressed to them? And then the follow-up then about simplicity is the simpler the email, the lower the grade level, the higher the likelihood of students actually going to read and comprehend the actual emails. I'm not sure what you mean by incentives, but just making sure that student communication is student focused. So are they actually resources that are relevant to students? I would think that would incentivize their communication or their response and their reading of an email.
Yeah, and I would say here too that the subject line really matters. So, and you may experience this with so many emails now coming in. You're probably doing a quick scan of what's in your inbox, and so making the subject line very clear. So, if it is important information about your course, or update on your online course, or update on your e-advising appointment, making it very, very clear what the message is about, and if there's any action items, deadline extended. So being very clear in the subject, keeping it very simple, keeping the email itself very simple. When we advise or consult with institutions on emails and email campaigns, we say that break down those paragraphs, as if there's an opportunity for you to use images, if there's an opportunity to break down the paragraphs into bullet points and make it very clear, and make the call to action very clear as well. So can you bold, underline, a different font color? Can you make it very clear what you're asking for the student at the end of the email or at the beginning of the email? If it's that you need for them to join this Facebook Live that you're hosting for all of the students in your, let's just say, Gear Up program, because I was a Gear Up student. And so if that's the case, then is it very clear how the student can register, what link they need to go to, what day it is, what time it is? Often, a lot of that is at the very bottom in the same size and color as everything else. And you have all of this other great information, of course, but the student isn't reading all of that, right? And so they are scanning their emails like we are. And so we need to get to the point, have a clear call to action, and make it simple and easy to read. And if what we say is like try to keep it to as the least number of emails as possible. So if there is an opportunity to do a newsletter where you wrap up everything in one space, that's great, so that you don't have to send multiple emails throughout the week on various things that are happening.
Lauren asked, I'm an advisor, don't have access to text. What would you suggest to make emails most effective? Here's where you got to balance length and detail of email versus how many resources you actually want to offer and how frequently you want to communicate. Because at one point, you don't want to blast out an email to a student every 6 hours. You want to consolidate information. So, Lauren, my best advice to you would be what absolutely needs to go out and sending that as simply and as consistently as possible. But also understand if you're going to email as an advisor, is enrollment management, is financial aid, is the dean of students, is emergency response services, who else is going to be emailing and when? So getting together with your leadership team and understanding email consistency would be right where I would start. Who is emailing students when? That would make the emails as effective as possible. I have a follow-up question about sharing COVID information. Should universities share COVID information? That is why the CDC and the WHO resources are the best, because institutions of higher education, obviously medical schools are different, but they are not public health organizations. That is not the profession that institutions of higher education are in largely. Yes, there are on-campus clinics, there are medical hospitals on colleges and university campuses, but redirecting students and stakeholders to trusted public health, global public health resources, that is the best bet. Obviously, if a campus community member contracts COVID, that might be a discussion you want to have with your leadership team. President Fenves here at UT Austin, his wife contracted COVID and he shared that information almost immediately. And that was very humanizing and heartening to read. And my condolences to him and his family. They'll pull through, obviously. But maybe updating campus statistics, but in terms of COVID statistics at a state or national or global level, I would redirect to trusted resources that are going to be updated from actual public health organizations. Over communication as students receive multiple messages via text. Obviously, students prefer email. We've had actually evidence and research studies that I've been a part of that non-traditional students actually might prefer email as well, just as much as text message. But then to your question, Claudette, doing that inventorying of who is texting, who is emailing, and how frequent. And then also doing a little bit of usability testing if you do have the ability to track links or student interactivity. What days of the week, what time of day does a student want to be communicated with? My work with Austin Community College kind of revealed that ACC students wanted to be texted about institutional information during the school week. They basically said, I'm not in school on the weekends, don't bother me. Now, that was a small subset of students, but understanding when to text and email students would be really, really important to avoid over communication and overstepping those professional and personal boundaries. You don't want to impinge or infringe upon a student's personal or family time. So Claudette, to your point, doing an inventory, who's texting, who's emailing, and when, and then doing some internal research in your organization about when is the best time in terms of sensitivity to students' personal life and just personal preferences.
One exercise that I do with the institutions I work with is called a communication mapping exercise. So I bring in stakeholders from across the organization or the institution, and we sit down and we each talk about, whether it's on a big whiteboard or with post-it notes, we just outline, well, who is sending what message to the students or to our audience, and what is the purpose, what is the goal, and how often are you sending it and through which channels. And a simple exercise like that, although it's difficult to do virtually, A simple exercise like that can really get us all with a big picture, kind of zoomed out picture of how are we talking to our students and how often are we doing it and which office is that message coming from. And if you find that, through this exercise that we're sending 7 text messages to a student in 1 week through these different offices, well, then folks need to come together and consolidate and have one text message communication campaign where we negotiate. On this Monday, the first Monday of the month, we will have a financial aid reminder. The following week, we'll have a student success tip. The following week, we're going to talk about how we have now changed our grading system to pass fail as opposed to the grade point. And so it's really important to negotiate with your coworkers and with your colleagues across the space and create one consolidated campaign so that there aren't campaigns coming from different offices at different time. And that's really what we would determine as over communication, right? So if each office, like Zach mentioned, he received 38 emails, Zach. If each office is sending an email and sending a text and making their own social media posts and they have their own Facebook group, that's a lot of communication. That's over communication. So let's get all of us together in one Zoom meeting or in one space, and let's figure out how we can consolidate our campaign to have one effective, strong, strategic campaign where all of our needs are being met.
Absolutely. And then the follow-up is, when do you start to see a little bit of decay with response rate? So if you're getting a lot of student responses and replies to emails, let's say, and you send those emails from emergency communication services or whatever department on campus, and you're getting a lot of responses, and then as you keep sending emails, the response rate keeps kind of petering off, then maybe you've reached oversaturation and that's when you're over communicating. But if you don't have that institutional evaluation tool, if you don't know when a student begins to not respond as frequently or as quickly, that could be an indicator of over communicating. Absolutely. And then Brittany asked, what's the best way to respond to questions when you don't have clear answers? Going back to consistency in communication, acknowledging that you've heard the question. So telling a student, we hear you. You're asking about housing, you're asking about food, you're asking about online learning resources, you're asking about what's going to happen to my financial aid, what's going to happen to my summer classes. Acknowledging those questions and say, we're working on it, we hear you, we are here for you. We will follow up as soon as we can give you high quality, accurate information. So that communication loop, if that's consistent, just acknowledging the question. There have been so many times personally, and I know a lot of y'all can vibe with me on this. If I ask a customer service associate in any industry, let's say it's cell phone, I'm having a hard time. When they say, we hear your question, let me work on that for you. Please hold for a few minutes while I work on your question. Acknowledging the question can be so powerful and produce so much patience within people. It's calming to be heard. It relieves stress and relieves anxiety if you feel like you're being heard. And if you can communicate that way with students and saying, listen, we hear you. We are on it. We are working on it. We are going to get back to you ASAP. That will alleviate a lot of concerns and ambiguity right now, because you shouldn't be expected to have immediate answers, because those immediate answers might not be accurate and high quality. And that's what students deserve right now.
I would say, just, want to add really quickly here, also validating how the student may feel because you don't have answers right now. And so, yes, we want to acknowledge that we hear them, we hear their question, but also like saying like, I don't have the answer for you right now. And I know that's very stressful, but we will get back to you soon. And here's when you can expect a response. And here is where you can go if you have additional questions, right? So the validation of the emotion, of the stress, the anxiety, is really just as important as acknowledging the question and being sympathetic to what the student may be feeling. And I want to add here too, like, students are human, we're human, and just adding a level of we're all in this together, that we're right there with our students, we're struggling. I found on many of my calls this week, I've heard people's kids in the background. I've had coworkers myself, waiting in long lines for groceries as they shop for their elderly parents. And so we're all going through this as a collective. And so are our students, and just acknowledging the humanity in that, and that it's overwhelming and that we will get through this together. Those are messages we're sending out to our partner institutions and to the students we text. And we find that even when students don't send a reply, if they have the appropriate device, they react to the message. So they may heart the message, or they may like or thumbs up the message. And that's because they're relating to us just being human and recognizing we can't really answer your question right now, but we know that you're struggling. We are too, and we're going to get on it. We're working on it for you. So we want to be respectful of your time. We're already 6 minutes over. We apologize. Thank you again so much. It's a Friday on a really long week and it's what will be probably very long weeks ahead of us. Thank you all for the amazing work that you do in your organizations, your institutions. To the extent that Zach and I can support you, please let us know. We're really thankful to have so many colleagues in this space that care so deeply about the students that we serve. And so it's very humbling for me as well. So we appreciate you. We'll follow up, early next week with the recording. But in the meantime, take care, stay safe, and let us know if there's any other way we can support you. Zach, any last words?
No, it's so heartening to see so many folks show up from different kinds of organizations. I mean, we are all in this together, and this is just an opportunity for Sana and I to kind of share with the community and give back, because right now it's going to take everybody. It's going to take all of us. So yes, thank you so much. And we'll follow up with other resources, and feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for coming. Have a great weekend. Happy Friday.
Bye, y'all. Take care.